Thanks everyone for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn session, all about MonQcle. My name is Alex Hess. I'm the Legal Training Manager at the Center for Public Health Law Research. I am sad to say that my colleague Alex Fraser is out sick, unfortunately, today. We all wish him well, but unfortunately, for those really specific tech questions, I may not have the answer to those for you, but I will be sure to direct them to him. My colleague Lizzie Platt has so graciously joined us today to help me answer some of those questions as well. So I'll do to the best of my abilities answer your questions, but if we don't know the answer, I'll make sure that Alex can answer those when he returns, our other Alex. Oh, and thanks for that question, Lynn. Yes, the recording for this session will be sent out to everyone. And I think for those who are joining this session, you'll also have access to a link to the slide deck. So you will have access to that after, I think it should be available, if not today, then this week. All right, we can get started. I want to make sure we have some time for questions at the end for folks who have any. Quick roadmap for what we'll be covering today. So I know many of you are probably already familiar with MonQcle, but if not, this will be a helpful kind of overview or maybe a refresher of MonQcle, which is the software that we use to do policy surveillance, really to do the vast majority of our work. It's such a vital part of what we do on a day-to-day basis at the center. And for folks who work with us externally, I'll also talk about how to use MonQcle and its functions to sort of fit maybe some unique project needs and goals you might have. Just a couple of examples of things that folks have maybe asked about, or methods that we've sort of applied to our own work that might be useful and helpful for you to know. And I'll cover a quick FAQ section for questions that we frequently are asked about MonQcle and sort of its intersection with the policy surveillance process generally. And then finally, just giving you some updates on the software and where it's headed, and new features that will be added, which is really exciting. I'm sure in the future you'll get much more information, but I kind of wanted to just give you the heads up if you haven't already heard from me or from us at the center about sort of what to expect in the future, which is really exciting. All right. Okay, so what is MonQcle? It is a sort of software as a service, as we like to call it, that was developed by our team to support not only our work, but the work of folks around the world who do policy surveillance. So, the CDC, for example, who use MonQcle to track and code law and policy. And we use it to build data that is eventually used in research and practice. And it's a platform that applies a question and answer framework, accommodating full PIN citations that link answers to the text that you as the user obviously have collected and identified as substantive to the area of policy that you are doing, surveillance for. So this service also includes tools to really easily integrate quality control, and also is a really easy process from doing the work to publication. I'll talk about that in just a second, but if you're familiar with Law Atlas, all of the data sets that you see there have been created using MonQcle. So it's a really easy tool that's been curated specifically for policy surveillance, with the sort of key goals in mind of organizing research and collaborating, building legal data across space and over time. So doing policy surveillance longitudinally, easily updating and maintaining the data, and then visualizing and sharing that. And that's, of course, on the Law Atlas platform, PDAPs, if you're familiar with that, prescription drug abuse database, policy database. So why use MonQcle? There are, of course, a number of other ways you can do policy surveillance. You can even do it, through Microsoft Excel, Word, even. There are a number of other different types of software that are available to you to do sort of similar tracking and coding. But we find that MonQcle is particularly helpful when doing policy surveillance for a number of reasons. Tracking laws, of course, requires researchers to examine policies across space and sometimes over time. But this process can be really unwieldy, and it can be really hard to track, spreadsheets, Word documents, to organize them, especially if you're working with perhaps a larger team. MonQcle's interface really allows you to organize the legal research, keep it up to date, and kind of easily track it without having to start over, without sort of missing key details. You can sort, mark up legal text, add references, quickly navigate using tags. So it's really easy to sort of search within, a record, to be able to view the legal text, view the coding side by side. It's sort of all in one place for you, and it's tracked over time by date. So it's very easy to view in that sense, and you don't sort of have to come up with your own method of organizing and tracking, which is really nice. It's kind of all been done for you. And tracking laws requires keeping up to date with new legislation, amendments. Maybe you're including case law that also impacts, your coding. So tracking law is, of course, important to understand how features, variations are changing over time. That's really like at the crux of what we're doing, right? And MonQcle really allows us to easily amend the text of the law to reflect those changes over time and across jurisdictions. It is also really easy to collaborate using MonQcle. So, a lot of this work can become really expensive and time consuming, especially if you're working with a large team that maybe you're supervising and need to keep track of. And so the nice thing about MonQcle is that it has flexible features, allowing supervisors to sort of apply your own management style and implement your own quality control settings to catch errors. And it's nice in that you can, users can look at the records together and sort of view the data in real time as a team. So in that sense, it also makes it a really easy to use tool. And then finally, sharing. So with MonQcle, you're able to not only just visualize the information and analyze it, but you can, share that with others who may be interested in your data and your findings really easily. MonQcle is also really nice in that it automatically produces a code book and, of course, the data. So that's work that you don't have to do. It's automatically produced. And then, of course, you can easily share it to Law Atlas or embed that same information, the sort of map, interactive features on, your organization's own website. So in that sense, it's really easy to use and flexible to not only create the data itself, but to also disseminate it and share it with others. And of course, MonQcle is the only software that was specifically designed for policy surveillance and advanced legal mapping. So with this process in mind, MonQcle really assists us with every step of the process. It gives you, of course, like I just mentioned, the ability to publish your research protocol, and also like I mentioned, data and code book, and all in sort of one place, which is really streamlined and makes it a lot easier to do. Again, the question and answer format makes it really easy from a user perspective to do the coding. It's very straightforward, and you don't necessarily need a whole lot of technological savvy to be able to clearly answer the coding questions. So if you're working on a team where you maybe have a longitudinal project and you have coders who are sort of joining and leaving your project over time, it can be really difficult to make sure that everyone's on the same page as far as how to do the coding, what the process looks like. And so I think in this sense, MonQcle makes it very straightforward. Being able to view the questions, answers, answering them is really straightforward. Doing the citations is a pretty simple process once you sort of learn it and get that down. So MonQcle really assists us in sort of all of these steps throughout the process of a policy surveillance project, and especially with quality control, that's a step that we sort of implement at every phase of the process to make sure we are eliminating bias and error to ultimately produce reliable, accurate, replicable data, right? And so MonQcle is really great as a tool to help us accomplish this in a number of different ways that many of you are probably familiar with. So one of those being redundant coding, being able to copy records and do independent sort of redundant coding across, all of the records in your data set. Make it much easier to be able to identify where maybe some errors are occurring and to be able to fix those. That's a nice tool. We also use what we call the caution note function to maybe note some sort of nuance or unanticipated feature about the law that might be relevant when we're thinking about adding new questions, or even making sure we capture something the same way consistently if there's some sort of nuance that we want to capture as a caution note. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with these sort of functions and tools, but I definitely wanted just to highlight the ways in which MonQcle is sort of at the center of a lot of these steps, even if it only seems like it's just part of the coding process. It's certainly not. And again, publication and dissemination, it makes it really sort of streamlined, easy to do. And tracking and updating the law. You can kind of pick up where a project has been left off on MonQcle and continue to track and update it. So something that we very frequently do at the center is take an existing cross-sectional data set and then update it to become longitudinal. And I think the fact that we do this through MonQcle makes that a really straightforward process. And for many folks, especially our interns, I'll use as an example, who join us for the summer, take on a lot of those projects with us. So they learn how to take an existing data set and update it over time. And they're able to learn that and work with us really quickly. And I think that's in large part thanks to having MonQcle as a tool to really be able to teach that in an easy, streamlined way. And then I just wanted to, again, show you what the codebook and data page look like when you sort of download them from MonQcle. So the codebook is, of course, a complete list of all the questions coded in a data set, has the question type, the variable name, values, labels. This is obviously really important if you're doing something like an evaluation of the data itself, and the sort of belle of the ball, the data that we use for evaluation, automatically produced by MonQcle. We also use the data not only just as part of like final publication, but we use it along the way. For something like coding review, we can download the data page and sort of analyze that to identify errors in coding or inconsistencies to make sure that we are being consistent across the board in answering certain questions. It's also an easy way of identifying questions that maybe were not answered at all, or answer choices that weren't answered across the data set, to kind of eliminate unnecessary answer choices or to fix maybe errors that we've identified. If we're not, done with the final coding process, this is definitely a sort of vital tool in helping us be able to do that. And so if you're working on a project and you have questions about how to kind of use the data or MonQcle generally, I'm happy to answer those questions or hop on a call and do some technical assistance for any specific aspect of not only the policy surveillance process, but MonQcle itself. And I'm sure Alex would be able to do the same. MonQcle in action. These are just a few, these are our databases that we commonly publish to, but like I mentioned, folks often publish the data to their own websites. Law Atlas is, of course, our flagship. website, which hosts over 140 data sets, I believe. These are all publicly available, and you can download the data, the code book, all of that information I just mentioned directly from Law Atlas. And it's, of course, a free service that you don't have to pay for. City Health, I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment, which is a specific project developed by the de Beaumont Foundation in partnership with Kaiser and also us at the center to rank cities across a policy package, which is really innovative way of sort of using the data. And then finally, PDAP's Prescription Drug Abuse Policy System is a database focused on drug opioid policy specifically. All of these use MonQcle to produce their data. Oh, thanks, Lizzie. She added Alex's email in the chat as well. I appreciate that. Okay, so that's kind of the background of MonQcle, the gist of it. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with that already, but I also kind of wanted to go a step further and talk about something that we don't as often get a chance to when we're doing our sort of MonQcle TA that might be helpful or hopefully spark some ideas for some of you. Getting creative and leveraging MonQcle features to fit your project needs and goals. And so I'm just kind of pulling from a couple of different unique examples here. These aren't the only ways you can sort of be creative with MonQcle. I'm sure you all in using MonQcle have probably thought of your own ways. And it's always really exciting to hear from those of you who are working on projects that are kind of unique in certain ways and how you've adapted MonQcle to fit your needs. But did want to highlight one thing, and that's bill tracking. And that's definitely something that we've done more of in the past year or so at the center. And so I feel like it would be a useful thing to maybe explain to you how we do it. It's really simple and straightforward. There's not a whole lot of difference between how we do this and sort of the normal policy surveillance process. But through bill tracking, we can, of course, collect, build, code, and track bills as they move through the legislative process, which I think is really interesting. So I guess typically, or sort of the standard way of doing this is to just track laws that are already in effect. But for some projects, you might be really interested in tracking the state of legislation and the rate at which maybe legislation is being adopted or not. And there have been a number of projects that we've worked on in recent years that this process has been really useful for. So like I mentioned, you're using the same policy surveillance methods and the sort of MonQcle building and coding process, but really the key difference here is that instead of the sort of standard one record per jurisdiction, we are doing one record per bill. And sometimes that can also be tracked longitudinally. So this example is from a data set tracking laws limiting public health authority. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with, sort of in response to COVID, there has been a sort of trend in legislation to limit the ability of state actors to respond to public health emergencies. And we were definitely noticing that while gaining a lot of traction in the legislature, some of these weren't being, adopted necessarily. And so making them, harder to actually track the laws themselves, but there was quite a bit of legal text and information that we could track from the bills. And so in doing this, this is just an example of the sort of first set of questions, but we're asking, is there a bill? Features about the bill, when was it introduced? What is the status? So, we can really track the process of this legislation in real time. And the way this was accomplished is, like I just mentioned, you're creating an actual record for the bill itself rather than the record for the state of Alaska, which would include maybe 5 different bills. We're separating them out so that we can track their progress over time individually and to be able to code the answer choices specifically based on that individual bill. So it makes for sort of a more dynamic way of being able to track these, just slightly tweaking our methods. So for Alaska, you see here, there's a number of records, but they are separated out, of course, by bill. So if you opened one of these records, you would of course only see one legal text entry, being that bill. And I think you see here at the bottom, House Bill 76 is being tracked as it changes over time. So I think that's a really unique way that we've been able to sort of harness MonQcle and be able to do something that more innovatively captures legislation sort of in real time. This is an example from one of our Sentinel surveillance data sets. Sentinel surveillance, I'm sorry if you hear a car honking in the background. Sentinel surveillance is really a process that applies similar policy surveillance methods, but really focusing on policies or areas of policy that might be rapidly emerging. Drug decriminalization legislation is one example of that, where we tracked where the legislation itself was actually occurring and the progress of the legislation rather than just laws in effect. So I know it's a little bit small in the corner here, but you can see that we've tracked legislation introduced but not enacted, where bills are pending, and then when laws are in effect. And so this allows us to really sort of capture the state of legislation in real time, and to get a better handle of where maybe some of the this policy interest is gaining more traction. Oh yeah, sorry, and I didn't mention the question up here is there legislation in the state that decriminalized personal possession of controlled substances? So this is a longitudinal project covering the entire US and DC, tracking movement in laws and bills from March 15th to August 1st of 2022, specifically capturing laws that are really broad sweeping in decriminalizing possession of controlled substances. So this is an example of one of our Sentinel surveillance projects that really sort of used this process of tracking bills and also laws at the same time. So that might be something that's of interest to you, and I'd be happy to talk with you more about sort of how to do this step by step, but wanted to really highlight the way we do it in MonQcle and how it's really straightforward, and also sort of the end result when you do that. That's bill tracking. Also, I wanted to talk about policy ranking. You might have heard us talk about City Health in the past, but I wanted to just again highlight this as a really effective way of leveraging the data itself to tell a story and really paint a picture. And that's again City Health project, which was developed in partnership with us at the center to develop this annual report tracking 75, I think, of the largest cities in the US on 12 policy areas that they've identified can improve people's access to healthy choices, address critical health disparities within their communities. And what City Health does is they award medals and sort of rank these cities based on their adoption and the progress in adopting these policies. So we have a gold, silver, bronze medal, and also can, they've listed here which cities in 2022 were awarded those medals. This is just kind of an overview of what cities have to sort of qualify for in order to obtain one of those medals. And I think this highlights a really innovative way of using the data that's produced using MonQcle, and then sort of quantifying that and being able to rank public health policymaking progress across the US. It's influential in a number of ways, especially for stakeholders like policymakers. This can be a really easy way of visualizing and then communicating the results and sort of giving it some more meaning as a result of this sort of example of a ranking process. The links to all the things that I'm mentioning are in the chat. So thanks so much, Lizzie and Lindsay, for including those. If anyone is interested, I definitely encourage you to check this out. It's a really exciting project. And then this is just an example of sort of how they've applied that ranking to a specific policy area. So this is the affordable housing trusts and what cities sort of have to qualify for the policies that they have to have in place to qualify for one of the 3 medals. So that's certainly something that, if you're interested in thinking about how to rank jurisdictions that you might be tracking for a project, I would definitely recommend looking into city health and thinking more about how, once you've created the data, sort of the next steps and where you can go with it from there. And then finally, this is less of a sort of tool I'm sure that many of you are familiar with, but I wanted to be sure, to give it some more credit, because I think this is something that we also use really frequently as we're doing our coding review, when we're doing final data checks. It's such a important tool, and I really wanted to highlight like its use and importance and how we use it in different ways, and that's the overview tool. And so all of you should have access to that if you have a current ongoing project in MonQcle. I'll show you what it looks like in just a moment, but the overview tool, you can use it a number of different ways. There's different sort of views: profile view to see the data displayed in a card format, or use the view to see data displayed in a map format. You can explore the data and filter it by clicking on the different answers and questions. And then the time slider, if you're doing a longitudinal project, you can slide over time to track how laws and maybe specific questions and answers have changed over time. And this is what it looks like. I know it's really small, but this is the view with the questions and answers on the left-hand side. And then, of course, your interactive map on the right-hand side. So it's really kind of a preview of exactly what you would see once you publish to Law Atlas, or once the data is ready to publish in general, right? If you see here right above the list of questions, that sort of row, that bar, is the time slider. So you can actually view it and see, based on that like yellow and blue right there, the adoption of the specific policies that are tracked for this question across the time that we've collected these policies for. So it's really helpful to kind of view at what point in time maybe there was an uptick in adoption of a certain law or feature of a law. And I think it's really nice to be able to view this, especially before, like as you're doing the coding, before it's actually published. This is something that we use to help us find maybe inconsistencies in coding, to double check and also easily review caution notes. Sometimes we use caution notes internally. Sometimes they're used to be sort of forward facing to provide more information. And we want to make sure that when we're doing that, that we're being consistent in using citations. And for things like that, it's really helpful to use the overview tool to be able to do that. I find it personally more easy to sort of read and view sometimes than the data. And so I just recommend, like, if you're using the data page to kind of do some of the spot checks or look for errors or look at, how you've answered a question or a caution note. And for me, I always kind of get tripped up using that. I find that using the overview tool can be a really helpful way of accomplishing the same thing. So again, you can use it to sort of clean the data, removing unanswered answer choices or questions that weren't answered, going back and reviewing, why they weren't answered, if they need an answer choice, if they weren't answered in error, or something like that. And another way this is really useful is that you can sort of begin to conceptualize your findings before you've actually finally published the data. So this is something that I think is really common for us, in that while we're doing the coding, of course, we can't really anticipate what the findings will be, but after maybe coding 10 or 20 states, we're starting to find some patterns, some interesting things of note that we want to keep track of, so that when we do come to publication and we want to disseminate our findings, we sort of already had an idea of what they would look like once we started doing the coding. I think that's a really great way of being able to develop anything from a policy brief, just to be able to summarize the findings in general. So I would definitely recommend, if you aren't using the overview tool as you're, conducting your policy surveillance project, to sort of explore it and see if you can find anything that's really useful for you, whether that's thinking about sort of trends before you've gotten to a place of finalizing the data, or just being able to conduct some of those quality control steps. All right. I'm going to answer a few questions that were frequently asked in sort of our TA sessions or when folks are using MonQcle. These are sort of at the intersection of MonQcle and then policy surveillance generally, I would say, but I find that they might be sort of helpful to talk about here. One is, do I always need to do redundant coding review? What is statistical quality control? Why should I use it, or should you at all? I don't have time to find the effective dates for every law. Can I skip this step? Or something is not working. What do I do? So I'll start with redundant coding. This might be a graphic that you're familiar with. The redundant coding process is really when we have two researchers / coders, independently viewing the legal text that's been collected and then doing the coding. So the way, if you're familiar with this process, we probably taught you, was that somebody is assigned as the original coder who creates the record, and then they copy that record in what we call a clone record, so that there's two exact identical versions of the legal text that's been captured, and you just have two different people doing the coding with, of course, not communicating how they're answering those questions. And this is really just to provide that second check on the data. Of course, this is to eliminate bias, to reduce error. And in our process, we typically start off with 100% redundant coding, and then we can reduce that as needed over time. This is an example of the coding review sheet, which we use to identify when we do have what's called a divergence, where the two coders coded something or caution noted something differently, right? We want to be able to view how they coded, when they coded differently, and to kind of see it all in one place, and then to decide as a team, along with the supervisor, how we're going to correct that coding moving forward. So of course you end up with just the one version of the coding that you'll make all your edits to, and that will be the final sort of version of that record. But this is really the process of how we do that coding review. So questions that were frequently asked for those of you who might be doing a project completely independently, sometimes coding review is not necessarily as practical. It's hard, of course, to also have just the time to be able to include redundant coding throughout the process, because that definitely adds a whole layer to the policy surveillance process. So rather than just doing the coding, producing the data, you're doing the coding twice, then you're reviewing the coding every time you do it, and then you're making changes. So of course, it's a very important part of quality control process that we encourage everyone to use to the extent that they can, but just practically speaking, sometimes it's not always possible. So the answer is kind of, it depends whether you have to do full coding or redundant coding or not. Our recommendation is typically where policy areas are really complex, we recommend you sort of do 100% redundant coding throughout the entire process. That's because the likelihood of error might be higher, just because you're dealing with something that is harder to maybe synthesize and analyze as compared to maybe policies that tend to be very straightforward. So that might be one consideration, is the complexity of the law, and also ways to sort of get around having to do full quality control if you don't have necessarily the time or resources, are to look to secondary sources and identify who's already captured some of the research that you're looking at, and to do what we call sort of a secondary source check, which is really another way of doing sort of a redundant coding, in the sense that, of course, you're not applying necessarily the same methods as this other resource, but you can identify where there's a lot of similarities and compare your coding across the information that they've provided. When you do that, you can identify where there are quote unquote divergences between you and this second resource and try to figure out why that's occurring. So maybe if they've cited to their information, look to what they've included. Do they capture a law that maybe was missing when you were doing this coding? And maybe that has some impact on why your coding would change, or maybe your scope is just simply different from that of this secondary resource. So that's all important information. I know that for projects that I've worked on where we've found maybe divergences between the way we've coded something and the way somebody else has identified or coded something, it's really helped us to be able to communicate our scope in our research protocol, because it sort of highlights why someone could maybe interpret something differently based on a different set of sort of standards and scheme for how they've captured this policy. And so in that sense, I feel like using secondary sources can be really useful to the extent that they exist and that you can access them, right? You can also do random spot checks and sort of pick a handful of records as a supervisor, maybe to, if you have, one coder, to kind of view and double check their coding. That's sort of a quicker way of being able to do it than having to require an entire redundant coding review. So I wanted to mention those as creative ways of sort of doing what coding review gets at without maybe having the time or the team size to be able to do that. Another way of doing this, and it's kind of a second layer of quality control, statistical quality control, or SQC process. So this is sort of post-production. Once the data has been produced, and let's say you've maybe gone through coding reviews and refined your data and your coding, but this is a sort of second step, and it's a process of randomly selecting a sample of data and testing it to ensure validity, reliability of the entire data set as a whole. The reason we do this is really because I'll kind of give you an example. Let's say you have two coders who read a question and answer it the same way, but perhaps they answered it in error or having some sort of misunderstanding of the meaning of the law. If that's an error and you do redundant coding review, of course, it's not going to be captured because there was no divergence in how those two coders decided to code, right? So if that's an error that wouldn't really be captured in coding review, that's where SQC comes in to help us be able to do this. So this is what the process looks like. Another nice feature about MonQcle is that for us, SQC is something that that MonQcle software can sort of easily spit out. So I think this is a feature that we at the center can provide for you. If you're interested in using SQC, we can give you the Excel sheet that MonQcle produces to be able to do this for your own team, which is really nice. You don't necessarily have to use MonQcle, but it's really easy in that it just kind of creates it for us. But the way this works is the supervisor will randomly select the coding instances. So you're not selecting entire records. You're really selecting a question and a specific answer choice. And MonQcle does this using, a statistical sort of standard to produce these instances. And really, it kind of looks like just a list of questions and answers that those who worked on the project can then review. And I won't explain the entire process today because it's a lot of information, but we can talk about it if you're interested in doing it for your team or for your project. But essentially what happens is the coders who worked on the project will be assigned a set of answers for jurisdictions that they did not themselves originally code, so that maybe they have less familiar with what the correct answer should be. And this is really just a way of providing a check so that you have a second sort of set of eyes on a random sample of policies, reviewing to make sure that the answer choices that are selected in MonQcle are correct. So you calculate the rate of divergence at the very end of SQC, with the goal of that being under 5%. So if it's over 5%, then we can't necessarily rely on the data's accuracy. So then we would repeat the process. And of course, along the way, you correct errors, and maybe you have to go back and review the way you've conceptualized a question or answer choice. But SQC, I think, is a really important process, again, especially if you're dealing with like a complex policy area. Maybe you had a coding review process where there weren't very many divergences. This can be really helpful to do that sort of second check to make sure that despite not having divergences, the coding itself can be reliable. And so I would recommend that, you consider SQC to be able to say that we are 95% confident that in repeated samples of the data sets, there is an error rate of 5% or less, right? So I would recommend considering SQC if you haven't already. Even if you did go through the full redundant coding process, maybe it's more useful to you if you did sort of a lower amount of redundant coding throughout the life of your project. It's very complicated, so I didn't want to belabor that too much here. But I think once you see what it looks like, it's pretty straightforward, easy to do. And the nice thing about that is we can sort of help you produce that and calculate the divergence rate so that you can get to a place where you feel really confident that your data is accurate. Effective dates. This is something that I feel like we get quite a few questions about as well. So there's a lot of considerations. Effective dates aren't always as straightforward as maybe it seems to be. We definitely talk about the fact that they can sometimes be hard to find. Maybe you have to go to the, state legislative website if you can't find it there. Sometimes we've used Time Online to go back and especially find effective dates for older laws, and that can certainly be a time-consuming process. So, maybe you're encountering difficulty in identifying historical dates, especially if your project goes far back in time. Maybe you have fewer resources, less time to complete your project. So a lot of folks ask us if they can sort of skip this step and create sort of an arbitrary effective date. But I would really kind of caution in thinking about that. It's definitely important to consider the purpose of collecting your data to ensure that you're capturing it really accurately, right? So if the data is really intended to be used for evaluation, I would stress the importance of really finding those effective dates. And if you're encountering any issues with being able to do that, please reach out to us, and we can help you sort of try to think about ways to identify effective dates, because certainly it can be challenging. But if you are planning to use the data for evaluation, capturing those effective dates, I think, is really important. If that's not really the goal of your project, then maybe you can sort of select sometimes, January 1st of the year as an effective date, but being sure to highlight and sort of caveat that in your protocol that that's a sort of arbitrarily defined effective date. And that's because, of course, if we're tracking something longitudinally and we are laying that across outcome data, that could have some kind of impact on when we're seeing these laws sort of come into effect, if that's not exactly the most accurate effective date. So I wanted to highlight that, of course. So it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule if you're just getting to a point where you cannot find an effective date, but really thinking about what the use of your data will be in the long run maybe can help you decide whether it's worth spending that extra amount of time or not. And finally, you may have countered a 504 error or some kind of issue with MonQcle. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second, but if this does happen to you, please don't hesitate to reach out. My and Alex Fraser's email are listed there for you if you run into an issue. Sometimes there might be a way we can help fix something on the back end. So if you're running into an issue and something's time is of the essence, there may be ways that we can help you kind of work around that in the meantime. We, of course, have folks with us who are working on the actual software coding technology that we can reach out to when there are issues. So we're kind of the center's contact for them. But in light of that, I also wanted to talk about sort of where we're headed with MonQcle and some really exciting updates to the software, which is kind of a little bit tied to why, if you have been having issues with MonQcle, it's not for nothing. MonQcle is getting a makeover. So the updates are underway, which is really exciting. MonQcle will have some new and improved features, and as those develop and we are able to sort of give you some mock-ups, that will definitely be communicated to MonQcle users so that you can receive training and learn more about those updates. So it won't just happen sort of in a vacuum. We'll definitely be keeping our users updated as MonQle's sort of 2.0 version is ready to use and view. Something that's also kind of a part of this process is Law Atlas's update, which I'm sure some of you have probably heard of or even gotten some more information about. So Law Atlas will also have a new version with more dynamic data visualization. And so it's kind of nice that these are happening together. But as part of this, software is not perfect. And so as these things are being updated, some buggy issues that might be happening with an existing MonQcle can occur. So we would definitely like to know, to the best extent that we can, sort of when those things are happening, or what you might be doing in the moment, but when MonQcle sort of shuts off for you, and having that information can be helpful for us to help make this a sort of easier transition to new MonQcle. But definitely, as part of new MonQcle, we will have an easier sort of navigability and interface for users. So that's really exciting. And thank you to those of you who are sort of hanging in there with us as we work to resolve those issues. But again, for questions, please definitely ask either Alex F. or myself if you're running into anything about MonQcle, would like some more training, or would like to talk about any of the stuff that we've covered today. We have a little bit of time for questions if anybody has any that they want to ask in the Q&A. And again, this recording will be available to you after the session, and along with a link to the slide deck. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, and happy to answer questions if anyone has any. Okay, looks like we have a question about formatting Excel so that it can later be exported to MonQcle. I think, don't know if Lizzie, it looks like she's typing an answer to that question to provide more information. Let me see. Lindsay, if you wanted to answer that question, I think you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me. That's a great question. With the new MonQcle design, we're developing an importer as well as hopefully having an exporter tool. We know that many of our researchers that work closely with us have already projects built in Excel or other programs. So the idea would be that it would be much easier to move or pivot your work to MonQcle once we have the redeveloped software. So that's something that is at top of mind, but I haven't taken it for a test drive yet. So.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thanks, Ellen, for that question. Yeah, I think that's something that in a lot of the work that we do, folks come to us with existing sort of policy surveillance or some way that they've tracked laws and would like to be able to input that into MonQcle. And up until now, we've kind of been doing that manually. So it's really exciting as part of the new sort of feature that we have to be able to not only turn the coding into Excel data, but to kind of vice versa, upload that to MonQcle. So thanks for that question. Erica asks, how do you add the time component to a jurisdiction? That's a good question. So I think it sounds like, are you asking about longitudinal building and coding? In that case, the way we do that is really by creating not just one record per jurisdiction in MonQcle, but one record per sort of time frame of a particular jurisdiction. So to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like, we use something called an amendment tracker, which tracks any time any of the text of the law. So of all the laws that we're tracking, we use this tool, this document called an amendment tracker, to show us every date at which something in the law changed. So whether that was an amendment or a new law was enacted or a law was repealed, we list those out according to the dates when all of those things occur. And then when we go to MonQcle, each of those individual dates becomes an individual record. So if I'm working with New Mexico abortion laws, and I see that, there was a law enacted in 2010, 2015, and 2020, January 1st of each of those years, let's say, just as an example, then my data set would have 3 New Mexico records, each starting on January 1st of those years, including that version of the law as it existed at that time. So in that sense, you would be able to track how each of those sets of laws had changed for that particular jurisdiction over the span of time that you're tracking. So I hope that answers your question. But if not, I can try to provide a better answer.
Yeah, that was an excellent explanation of that. And I'll just add that the date field, so the effective date field and then your valid through date field are standard variables in every record that Alex mentioned. So those would be fields that would automatically populate. You don't have to worry about adding them to your record. In current MonQcle and new MonQcle, those are standard along with the jurisdiction itself. So every time that you code a record, whether it's a state or city or school district or country, it will ask you for dates.
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, Erica, if you have any more questions or want help with doing that, please feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to help.
Looks like there's a follow-up.
What happens if you don't know if there will be a change in law ahead of time? For example, doing workers' compensation for agricultural workers, and a lot of these laws came to effect before my time of interest, but I know there could be a change within that time frame. It sounds like.
So you would want the state of the law as it existed on January 1, 2001. So even if the law is outdated and it's from 1980, if that's the latest time it changed between 1980 and 2001, you would pull in that 1980 law. And then in terms of knowing ahead of time, that tool that Alex mentioned, the amendment tracker, where you capture all the changes in the law during your time period, is something you want to do before you start building in MonQcle. You do want to investigate all changes prior to going into the system. So if there's 5 changes for a particular state related to a law, you want that document filled out so that you then have 5 records in MonQcle. It is possible to do it at a later date, but it will cause more work. But that's a great question. And if you have an active project, we're always happy to give TA related to active projects.
Thank you, Lindsay. Any other questions? Looks like we're almost out of time for today, but we do have a couple more minutes. And again, if you have any questions you want to ask us directly, you have our contact information in the chat, and it's also included in the slides. If you want to review those and have questions for us at a later time. And thank you so much to Hope and Lizzie and Lindsay for joining and helping me answer those questions today. Much appreciated. All right. Well, I think we can wrap up here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn session. Keep an eye out for future trainings and updates for MonQcle and Law Atlas in the future. Thanks, everyone.